Danny had never been one to shy away from challenge, but this was different. The pain in his ribs was a constant, gnawing presence, an ache that didn't seem to have a cure. His ankle, still swollen from the shuttle accident, wasn't much better. It was supposed to be healing, but every time he moved, it reminded him of how far he had to go. He leaned against the doorframe of the lecture hall, watching the alien cadets file in. The Academy was an interspecies institution, where beings from across the galaxy came to learn about each other's cultures, technologies, and biology. Humans were a rarity here. Danny was one of the few who had earned his spot, albeit with a great deal of effort and a rather unfortunate series of injuries. Despite his discomfort, he made his way inside, wincing as his ribs protested with each step. The lecture hall was massive, filled with rows of tiered seats and screens projecting information on the creature that was the subject of today's lesson, the Vorkos. Instructor Yar, a being of 3 different species' genetic makeup, was standing in front of a holographic projection of the creature. A low hum echoed throughout the room as the lights dimmed. The creature in the projection was massive, its jagged, obsidian-black armor plating gleaming as it moved across the screen. It was a creature from the planet Thranox, known as a Class 5 Apex, a designation that made it one of the most deadly creatures known to the galaxy. Class 5? Yar's voice resonated, a mixture of awe and scientific intrigue. A predator of the highest order, the Vorkos, 8 feet of muscle and armor capable of tearing through composite metals with its claws and dissolving prey with its saliva. Danny sat at the back of the room, attempting to ignore the throbbing pain from his injuries. The last thing he wanted was to be here, but he knew that if he missed one more class, he'd be kicked out of the program. So he endured it, the discomfort, the exhaustion, the helplessness of being stuck in his own body. The holographic image flickered slightly as Yar's finger hovered over the control panel. The projection shifted, zooming in on the creature's face. Its glowing eyes stared out at the audience, unblinking, calculating. Yar continued, "The Vorkos doesn't kill for hunger or dominance. It kills because everything it sees could be a threat. Not even its own species is exempt. And yet," he paused, looking around the room at the cadets, "we've managed to bring one here, a tranquilized specimen, and today we will observe it, learn about it." A soft murmur spread through the room as the cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Danny noticed the reptilian students clicking their jaws in uneasy whispers, the Vin cadets shimmering slightly with discomfort, and even the massive Brassin twins in the front row, who were rarely fazed by anything, leaned back in their seats. Danny didn't look at the screens. His eyes were fixed on the live display in the center of the room. There behind the shimmering containment field stood the real creature. It was just as massive as the projection, though it seemed strangely still, as if at rest. The field hummed faintly, the only sound that could be heard besides the soft stir of anxious students. The Vorkos' eyes gleamed from the darkness, calculating as though it was aware of their every movement. Danny tried not to flinch when its gaze swept over the room. The tension was palpable, but it was clear the creature wasn't here to put on a show. It was just there, looming. For a moment, Danny wondered if it could sense his discomfort, his vulnerability. His injuries were still fresh, the medic's warnings about his fractured ribs and ankle echoing in his mind. He couldn't move like he used to, couldn't even think straight sometimes. The meds, combined with his exhaustion, made everything feel like a haze. But right now, this lecture, this creature, was the last thing on his mind. "Danny," Yar's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to find the instructor's many eyes fixed on him. "Do you have any questions about the creature's physiology?" Danny blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He was supposed to answer. He struggled to focus, to clear the fog in his mind. Finally, he shook his head, a tight-lipped grin appearing on his face as he mumbled, "No, sir." Yar nodded, his eyes flicking back to the creature. "This one," he said, tapping a few controls, "is a captive. It's been sedated, tranquilized. Still, we don't know if the field will hold." Danny's stomach tightened. He couldn't stop staring at the creature, the looming mass of muscles and armor behind the field. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. He was frozen, focused solely on the Vorkos. Yar clicked his tongue, noticing the reaction in the room. "For those who may feel uneasy, understand this. The Vorkos doesn't kill out of hunger. It's purely instinctual. It kills because everything it sees is a potential threat." The lights flickered, the hum of the containment field briefly dipping in pitch before the power stabilized. The students in the room relaxed slightly. Now, Yar continued, we're going to take a closer look. Danny, he motioned toward the back where Danny sat. Please come forward. We're going to introduce the cadets to a unique specimen. One of our own has volunteered for this lesson. Danny blinked again, confused. Wait, what? The lights flickered again, this time with a sharp buzz. The field hummed louder, and the creature's head turned slowly toward Danny. Without thinking, Danny stood, pushing through the pain in his ribs. He felt his heart race as he limped down the aisle toward the center. It was then that the unthinkable happened. The containment field let out a soft, popping noise. For a split second, Danny thought he'd imagined it. But then the hum lowered, and before anyone could react, the Vorkos charged. It wasn't a slow, lumbering attack. It was fast, almost too fast for the eye to follow. The front panel of the containment field exploded outwards with a shower of sparks and metal shards. The beast's massive frame twisted, and the room erupted in chaos. Screams filled the air. Desks were overturned. Cadets scattered in every direction, some tripping over one another in their panic. The Brasson twins roared as they tried to push toward the door, only to find it locked by the failing power systems. Danny was frozen, unable to move fast enough. His ribs ached as he tried to stand tall, the weight of his injuries pulling him down. The Vorkos didn't hesitate. It was moving toward him, its claws tapping against the floor with each step. It was as though the world had slowed down, time stretching into a never-ending moment of terror. But then, just as it reached him, something unexpected happened. The creature stopped. Its massive head tilted slightly, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Its glowing eyes narrowed, studying him with an almost curious intensity. For a second, Danny thought it might pounce. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Instead, the Vorkos laid down beside him. It curled its body in a protective manner, pressing its armored back lightly against Danny's legs. A low, vibrating hum rumbled through the air. It was purring. Danny blinked, his mind struggling to process what was happening. No, this couldn't be real. This creature, this apex predator, wasn't attacking him. It was purring. He closed his eyes, struggling to breathe through the sudden wave of disbelief. No, he whispered hoarsely. Nope, I must be concussed. I have to be concussed. The room had gone silent. The cadets, the instructor, even the cameras overhead, everyone was frozen, watching. Danny dared to open his eyes. The Vorkos was still there, its massive head resting against his leg, its eyes half closed, vibrating with each soft hum. What the hell, Danny mumbled to himself. This is impossible. The medbay smelled sterile, clean, with the faint tang of antiseptic hanging in the air. The white lights above hummed softly, casting a cold, clinical glow over everything. Danny lay on a padded bed, the pain from his ribs and ankle a dull, constant reminder of his broken body. He had expected to be in the medbay for a few hours, maybe a day, but the hours dragged on. The true impact of what had just happened, the bizarre bond between him and the Vorkos, had yet to fully settle in. His right ankle was still immobilized in a stabilizer, his ribs wrapped tightly beneath a compression brace. The bruising was starting to fade, but he could feel every shift, every movement. It was hard to breathe properly, but the worst part wasn't the physical pain anymore. It was the confusion, the overwhelming sense of disbelief. The strange thing, though, was that through it all, Delta-7 hadn't left his side. The creature, this apex predator, the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, had curled up next to him like an oversized cat, purring softly as if Danny were its mother, its pack, its reason for existing. At first, he thought he had imagined it. It had to be a dream, a concussion-induced hallucination. But then Delta-7's massive, armored form had remained pressed against him, unwavering. Every time a medic or security officer had tried to approach, the creature growled softly, a low, rumbling warning that made them think twice before moving any closer. A soft chime sounded, and the door to the medbay opened. Dr. Havors, the lead xenobiologist, stepped in with a tablet in his hand. He was a tall, lithe creature with pale green skin and 4 long arms, each ending in delicate fingers that hovered over the tablet as he approached Danny. "Cadet Danny, how are you feeling today?" Dr. Havors asked, his voice as smooth as ever, but with an edge of curiosity. He wasn't asking out of concern for Danny's physical state, not really. He wanted to know about the creature, the bond between them. Danny's eyes flickered toward Delta-7, who was still lying next to him, its head resting on Danny's chest. The creature's eyes were half closed in a state of tranquility, its breathing slow and steady. I'm fine, Danny muttered. I think. My ribs are still sore and my ankle feels like it's been shoved through a wall, but other than that, I'm alive. Dr. Havors nodded, his large eyes glinting with something akin to excitement. I'd imagine it's a bit more than just alive, Cadet. You've become something of an anomaly. Tell me about it, Danny replied, rubbing his temple with his uninjured hand. This whole thing is insane. Dr. Havors stepped closer, his gaze flicking between Danny and the Vorkos. What we're witnessing here is unprecedented. No Vorkos has ever been imprinted by another species, let alone a human. I'm sure you've been briefed on the creature's behavioral patterns. Danny grunted, nodding weakly. Yeah, I remember. The Vorkos is an apex predator. It kills because it sees everything as a threat. It doesn't form bonds, it doesn't care about anything but survival. Exactly, and yet here we are with you, Cadet Danny, and this creature who should want nothing more than to tear you apart. But instead, Dr. Havors paused, glancing at Delta 7. Instead, it's acting like, well, a pet. The creature's large eyes flicked open at the mention of its name, and it slowly, almost lazily, turned its head to look at Dr. Havors. The deep, low growl that followed was enough to make the doctor take a cautious step back, his expression momentarily betraying his fear. Right, Danny said dryly. Pet, what's the catch? I feel like I'm being fed some sort of new species management protocol. Dr. Havors smiled slightly, clearly entertained by Danny's sarcasm, but his eyes never left the creature. What I'm suggesting, Cadet, is that this might be a turning point in the study of xenobiology. Your bond with this creature could rewrite everything we know about imprinting, about cross-species relationships. It's never been documented, let alone studied in real time. Great, Danny said, wincing as he adjusted his position on the bed. So, what does this mean? I'm stuck with a giant, deadly house cat for the rest of my life. You may be, Havors said with a shrug, or perhaps you're the one to unravel a mystery that's never been solved. You've been imprinted on by a Class 5 apex predator. That's a rare thing in and of itself. Danny didn't respond right away. He looked at Delta 7, who was now staring at him, its eyes dark and unreadable. He thought of everything the creature had been capable of, its speed, its strength, the power behind every movement. It could kill with a swipe of its claws, and yet it had protected him. I didn't do anything, Danny muttered, looking at the ceiling, trying to escape the weight of the creature's gaze. I didn't ask for this, I was just sitting there, it chose me. Havors looked thoughtful for a moment. Theories vary, but the most likely explanation is that it's your vulnerability that drew it in. Your injuries. The Vorkos is a predator. It bonds protectively with the weak, the injured, the ones that might need its care. To it, you're not a threat. You're part of its litter now, in a sense. Danny blinked at the implication, his heart sinking. So, what, I'm some kind of wounded prey, and it's decided I'm worth protecting? In a way, yes, Havors replied. But it's more complex than that. We need to observe this bond, learn how it forms, how it sustains itself. The Vorkos is imprinted on you, but it's unclear how long this will last, or if it will evolve into something else. Danny glanced down at the creature, who was now lightly pressing its head against his leg. The warmth of its body felt oddly comforting, but the realization that he was the focal point of some unknown, dangerous bond made him shiver. I'm a science experiment, he said quietly. Havors gave him a small, understanding smile. In many ways, yes, but you're also the first person in history to form such a bond with a Class 5 predator. That, Cadet Danny, is something no one expected. Danny's head swam with confusion, frustration, and yes, a little bit of fear. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was for certain. He wasn't getting out of this anytime soon. Before he could respond, the door to the medbay opened again, and another figure entered. This time, it was Instructor Yar. His tall, multifaceted body stood silhouetted in the doorway, his 4 eyes scanning the room with a calm, almost detached gaze. We need to talk about your future, Cadet Danny, Yar said, his voice low and serious. The Academy's council has requested your presence. There's a situation developing. Danny tensed, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. What kind of situation? Yar's eyes narrowed slightly. The Academy is under pressure from several factions. Some believe your bond with Delta 7 is a risk. Others think it could lead to something even more dangerous. He hesitated. It's not just about the creature anymore. You're involved in something much bigger. Danny's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting something like this. So, what happens now? Yar stepped forward, glancing at Delta 7, who was now purring louder, seemingly unaware of the impending storm. We need you to attend a council meeting. Soon. It will determine how the Academy moves forward with both you and your new companion. Danny swallowed hard. The journey he'd found himself on was only beginning. Danny sat at the long, oval table in the council chamber, surrounded by figures from every corner of the Academy. He was still recovering, his body a mass of bruises and soreness, but today he couldn't ignore the deeper ache in his chest. Something bigger than physical pain was gnawing at him. Around him, the room was filled with various species, reptilian, insectoid, and crystalline beings all studying him, studying his bond with the Vorkos, Delta 7. Danny could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their scrutiny far heavier than any injury could ever be. He was a cadet supposed to be learning alongside them, not the subject of a high-stakes galactic debate. And yet here he was, caught in a web he didn't ask for. At the head of the table, instructor Yar sat, his 4 eyes focused on Danny as the room hummed with nervous energy. A panel of experts had been assembled: xenobiologists, behavioral scientists, security officers, and even representatives from the Brassin Council. Their presence was a clear sign that the Academy was taking this seriously, perhaps too seriously. Danny couldn't help but shift uncomfortably in his seat. He still hadn't fully wrapped his mind around the situation. One moment he was just another cadet, injured, recovering, struggling to keep up. The next he had an apex predator imprinted on him, a creature that could tear through metal, and yet it was cuddling with him like a pet. Cadet Danny, Yar's voice was calm but firm. We've gathered to discuss the implications of your bond with Delta 7. The Council is concerned about the possible consequences. Your physical and mental state, as well as Delta 7's unpredictable behavior, requires immediate attention. Danny's breath hitched and he felt his stomach twist. The Council had been speaking in euphemisms, unpredictable behavior, implications. The truth was simpler, darker. Some of them didn't trust what had happened, and that fear was leaking into the Academy's decisions. Do you mean that you want to remove Delta 7 from my care? Danny asked, his voice quiet but cutting. The question hung in the air like a thundercloud, and all eyes turned toward him. There was a brief pause before a figure to Danny's right. A Brassin elder spoke up. Her 6 lungs worked in tandem, her deep, resonant voice shaking the air. The Vorkos is an apex predator. Its bond with you is an anomaly, a potential threat. We cannot ignore the possibility that it may change its behavior at any moment. Danny's eyes flicked toward the massive creature, who was sitting just outside the chamber, just behind a reinforced barrier, waiting for him. It was as still as stone, but he could feel its presence, its energy radiating through the room. She's right, another voice added, sharp and clipped. A Vin cadet, his skin shifting between pale hues of discomfort. We have protocols for dealing with dangerous species, especially when they form attachments. This thing is not an emotional support animal. It's a weapon. Danny clenched his jaw, his hand involuntarily tightening on the edge of the table. It hasn't attacked anyone, he said, forcing himself to stay calm. It's not a threat. You don't understand, the Brassin elder replied, her gaze cold. It doesn't matter what it's done now. A creature like that can turn. Even a slight change in its environment could trigger a violent response. Yar's voice cut through the tension like a knife. We cannot ignore the scientific potential of this bond either. The implications are far-reaching, and they go beyond the Academy. This is uncharted territory, and the Council is divided. Another voice, softer but filled with authority, joined the conversation. It was Dr. Havors, who had been present earlier. His calm, measured tone broke through the growing storm. There is merit to both sides, but let's not forget the most important factor here. Delta 7 has not harmed Cadet Danny, and we cannot ignore the possibility that this bond, though unprecedented, may hold the key to understanding the deep, evolutionary connections between species. Danny felt a flicker of hope at those words, but it quickly died when the Brassin elder glared at Havors. You're speaking from a place of academic curiosity, Dr. Havors, not from a place of safety. We cannot afford to let this experiment continue unchecked. The argument was growing heated. Danny's pulse quickened, and the room seemed to close in on him. He wasn't just some cadet anymore. He was the center of a dangerous ideological battle, caught between scientific advancement and the fear of the unknown. You're asking us to risk everything for the sake of some theory, the Brassin elder continued. I don't care how harmless it seems now. I've seen what creatures like that can do when they shift. Yar's 4 eyes narrowed, and his voice, though calm, was filled with an edge of frustration. We must continue observing it. This is bigger than you, Cadet Daney. You may be the key to unlocking a new understanding of predator psychology. And if that understanding puts the entire Academy at risk, the Brassin Elder demanded. Then we will deal with that risk, Yar replied, his tone firm. But not without proper data, not without completing this research. Daney's heart was racing. The walls were closing in. On one side, the Brassins wanted him gone. On the other, Yar and Dr. Havors wanted to keep going, keep studying the bond between him and Delta-7. Daney wasn't sure where he stood anymore, but it was clear that neither side had his best interests in mind. He glanced out of the corner of his eye toward the reinforced glass wall that separated him from Delta-7. The creature was still there, but it was shifting slightly, as though it sensed Daney's unease. The door to the council chamber slid open, and a new figure entered. It was Lieutenant Havers, the head of security. His stoic face showed no emotion, but his eyes flicked toward Daney before settling on the council. There's been a development, Lieutenant Havers announced, his voice low. Delta-7 has breached the barrier. It's trying to get inside the chamber. Daney's blood ran cold. He turned to look at Yar, but the instructor's face had gone pale. What do you mean, breach the barrier? Daney asked, his voice hoarse. Lieutenant Havers met Daney's gaze with a solemn look. It's no longer just protecting you, Cadet, it's claiming you. And with that, the true danger of the situation hit him. This wasn't just about a creature protecting him. This wasn't just a bond of trust. This was something more primal, something that had never been seen before, and whatever it was willing to do anything to keep him close. Daney's heart hammered in his chest as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. The Academy's council chamber, once buzzing with heated debate, had gone completely silent. The news that Delta-7 had breached the reinforced barrier was the last thing anyone had expected. The lieutenant's words echoed in Daney's mind. It's trying to get inside the chamber. It's claiming you. Daney couldn't breathe. He turned his gaze back to the door, trying to process what had happened. The massive Vorkos, a creature capable of shredding through walls and tearing apart entire squads of soldiers, was now at the door. And it wasn't just a beast anymore, it was his. Protector, companion, something darker and more uncontrollable. Get him out of here, the Brassin Elder snapped, rising from her seat. Her voice was filled with panic. Now. Daney could barely move. His body still ached from the earlier injuries, but his mind was racing. He wasn't sure what to think anymore. Should he be terrified of Delta-7, or was the creature really just trying to protect him? The doors slammed shut, sealing the chamber, and Daney was left standing, caught between two worlds. The political maneuverings of the council and the primal bond that had unexpectedly formed between him and a creature that could end his life in seconds. Yar stood, his 4 eyes focused with an intensity Daney hadn't seen before. This is not a time for fear, he said sharply. The creature is not acting out of aggression. It's responding to an instinct that we don't fully understand yet. Daney couldn't keep quiet anymore. It's a predator, Yar, a Class 5 apex, he said, his voice raw. What happens when it decides I'm no longer useful to it? Yar's gaze softened, though the tension in his posture remained. We're not there yet, Cadet. We're studying the bond between you two. This could be the key to a breakthrough in xenobiology. But first, we need to ensure the safety of everyone here. A low growl echoed from the other side of the door. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. Daney could feel it in his chest. The Vorkos was close, and it wasn't backing down. The creature's behavior is escalating, Dr. Havors said, his voice tinged with anxiety. We need to act quickly before things get out of hand. But how do we act? Daney asked, frustration building. What do you want me to do? Should I just let it keep following me around? I'm not some specimen to be studied. Havors was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. You're more than a specimen, Cadet. You're part of a historic event. But if this bond continues to intensify, it could become a liability for the Academy. We have to assess whether this relationship is sustainable or if we need to sever the connection. Sever, the word hit Daney like a punch to the gut. Could they really take Delta-7 away from him? The creature had imprinted on him, sure, but what would happen if they separated them? Would the Vorkos lash out in desperation? Would it kill everyone in its path? Before Danny could respond, the doors to the chamber began to tremble under the Vorkos's weight. It was trying to break through. "We don't have much time," Lieutenant Havers said, his voice hard with urgency. "We need to decide what to do now." Danny looked from one face to another, searching for some sign of hope, some sense of direction. But all he saw were conflicted, panicked expressions. The academy was full of experts, but no one seemed to have an answer. And then there was the sound of something snapping, metal bending under immense pressure. The creature was getting closer. "I need to see it," Danny said suddenly, pushing himself to his feet. His voice was hoarse but resolute. "I need to see Delta 7, I need to talk to it." "Cadet," Yar warned, his tone a mixture of concern and authority. "It's too dangerous. The creature is agitated if you step out there." Danny didn't let him finish. With a sharp breath, he hobbled towards the door, ignoring the pain in his ribs and ankle. "I'm not letting anyone else deal with this," he said, though it was as much to himself as it was to the others. "If it's going to get worse, it's going to do it with me." He reached the door just as another tremor shook the room. The Vorkos's growl had turned into a deep, resonant rumble, vibrating through the walls. "Cadet, I implore you," Dr. Havers started, but Danny didn't listen. He braced himself against the doorframe and slowly, painfully, pushed the door open just enough to slip outside. What greeted him was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Delta 7 stood just beyond the door, its massive form pressed against the reinforced glass of the barrier. The creature's gleaming obsidian armor was scratched and scorched in places, but it remained poised, its eyes glowing brightly, unblinking. It watched Danny with an intensity that was almost unnerving, as if the creature could see into his very soul. For a moment, neither moved. Then Danny took a step forward, carefully and slowly. His breath was shallow, but he forced himself to stay calm. He was still unsure of what this bond meant, but if there was a chance to understand it, to control it, he had to take it. "Delta 7, Danny called softly, his voice shaking with a mix of exhaustion and fear. The creature's head tilted slightly, its glowing eyes never leaving him. "It's just me. It's okay. You're not alone." The creature's nostrils flared as it took a step forward, the ground beneath it shaking slightly with each heavy movement. It pressed its head against the glass, its sharp claws tapping lightly against the surface as though trying to reach him. Danny reached out, his hand brushing lightly against the cool glass. The air between them seemed to hum, alive with a strange energy that made his skin tingle. Suddenly, the barrier cracked. It was a small, hairline fracture at first, barely visible. But the crack spread quickly, the glass shattering with a loud crack that echoed through the chamber. The doors to the council room slammed shut, but it was too late. Delta 7 was already inside. The Vorkos didn't attack, though. Instead, it walked slowly towards Danny, as if drawn by some unseen force. Its massive head lowered slightly, and for a moment, Danny saw something he hadn't expected. There was no aggression in the creature's eyes, only a kind of understanding. It wasn't just following him, it was connecting with him. The room was still. The council members, the security officers, even Yar stood frozen, watching as Delta 7 came to a stop directly in front of Danny. The creature's heavy breathing was the only sound in the room, and the tension was so thick that it felt like the walls might collapse. "I'm not leaving," Danny whispered, the words barely audible. The moment the words left his mouth, Delta 7 lowered its massive body to the ground, curling itself around Danny as it had done before, but now it was different. It wasn't just a strange occurrence anymore. It was a choice. Delta 7 had claimed him, and now it seemed Danny had no choice but to accept it. The council members stared in stunned silence, the weight of the situation settling in. The bond was undeniable now. It wasn't just scientific curiosity. It was survival. The Academy had no choice but to make a decision. And Danny knew, deep down, that no matter what happened next, his life would never be the same again. The days that followed the council meeting were a blur of medical reports, debates, and a growing sense of unease among the Academy staff. Danny had been cleared to return to his quarters, but his movements were limited, his injuries still needing time to heal. Despite the physical pain, it was the tension that weighed on him most. Delta 7 had become a permanent presence in his life, constantly at his side. The creature followed him wherever he went, a hulking shadow that cast a long, unsettling presence in the halls of the Academy. It wasn't just a companion anymore, it was his companion. The bond between them, though inexplicable, was undeniable. Danny sat in his quarters one evening looking at the data pad in his hands. The Academy had sent him a report full of statistics, observations, and recommendations about the Vorko's imprinting event. It was a flood of information that made his head spin. The report was clear. There were no precedents for something like this, and the potential consequences were unpredictable. Some viewed it as a scientific marvel, a breakthrough in understanding predator psychology, while others saw it as a ticking time bomb. Danny set the data pad down with a sigh, rubbing his temples. He could feel Delta 7's presence just outside the door, waiting patiently for him. The creature was never far away. Sometimes it would nuzzle at the door, its massive form filling the small space of his quarters. And though it was incredibly intelligent, it had its own way of showing affection, pressing its large head against the walls, nudging its snout into the cracks of the door, or simply sitting still, watching Danny with its unblinking gaze. It was hard to explain. The creature wasn't just following him, it was attaching itself to him. There was something protective in the way it acted, almost as if it feared losing him. The thought made Danny uneasy. Was he becoming too dependent on the creature? Was it possible that he was beginning to rely on Delta 7 for more than just survival? There was a knock at the door, and Danny didn't need to ask who it was. He could feel Delta 7's immediate reaction, the creature shifting slightly as if on alert. "Come in," Danny called, not bothering to stand. He had gotten used to his condition and the fact that he couldn't move around like he used to. The pain was a constant companion, but the worst part was the uncertainty of it all. Instructor Yar entered, his 6 limbs moving gracefully as he navigated the tight quarters. His 4 eyes focused on Danny with the precision of someone who was always observing, always calculating. "Cadet Danny," Yar greeted him, his tone neutral. But there was something in his expression that suggested this meeting was more than routine. "Sir," Danny responded, sitting up straighter. "What's the news? I take it you're not here for a checkup on my injuries." Yar chuckled softly, the sound surprisingly warm. "No, Cadet, you've healed well considering the circumstances, but we have a new development." Danny's stomach dropped. "What kind of development?" Yar's expression shifted to something more serious. "The Council has decided to conduct a field test. They want to send you and Delta 7 to the planet THR to observe the Vorkos in its natural habitat. It's a risk, Cadet, but we believe it's the next step in understanding this bond between you." Danny froze, his mind raced. "Wait, you want me to go to THR with Delta 7, where we could be walking straight into a hostile environment? You've seen what that planet's like, it's a death world." Yar nodded, his expression unchanging. "Precisely. It's a dangerous world, but it will give us critical data on how the Vorkos behaves in its natural environment. You are the only one who has bonded with this creature, and the Council believes that you are the key to understanding its psychology. This isn't just about you anymore, Cadet. It's about what this bond could mean for the entire galaxy." Danny stared at Yar, trying to process the weight of his words. Going to THR wasn't just a field mission, it was a life-or-death gamble. He was being sent to a planet filled with apex predators, where survival was a constant battle. And the only thing that might keep him alive was Delta 7, a creature who, despite its bond with him, was still fundamentally unpredictable. "Are you sure about this?" Danny asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I mean, do you really think this is the best course of action?" Yar's gaze softened. "It's not ideal, but it's the only way to gather the data we need. And frankly, Cadet, there's no one else who can do this." Danny clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the bed. "And what happens if it doesn't work? What if Delta 7 turns on us? What if I can't control it anymore?" Yar's expression remained steady. "That's a risk we'll have to take, but I believe in you, Cadet. I believe you can control this bond. You've already proven yourself once. You survived the initial breach, and now you'll survive the field test." Danny stared at him, his mind spinning. The Academy was pushing him into a corner, giving him no other choice but to go along with their plan. If he refused, it would only confirm their worst fears, that he couldn't control the bond, that he wasn't capable of handling the Vorkos. And yet there was another part of him, the part that had kept him alive through the shuttle accident, through his injuries, through the panic, that didn't want to back down. He didn't want to be seen as weak, as someone who couldn't handle the pressure. He had survived the impossible once. Maybe he could do it again. But the weight of the decision was heavy. THR was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a world where only the strongest survived, and in the back of his mind he couldn't shake the fear that Delta 7 might not be as loyal as he hoped. "All right," Danny said, his voice low but determined. "I'll do it. I'll go to THR Nox, but I want full support. I want an escape plan. If anything goes wrong, if the bond breaks, or if Delta 7 turns on us, I need a way out." Yar's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of approval. "Understood. We'll prepare the necessary precautions. But you should know, Cadet, if this succeeds, you will be the first human to bond with a Class 5 predator and survive. You'll change everything. You'll prove that humanity can coexist with the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy." Danny nodded, though the weight of his decision still hung heavy on his shoulders. "Let's just make sure I survive first, all right." Yar gave a small, approving smile. "Agreed, prepare yourself. You'll be leaving within the next 48 hours. As Yar left the room, Danny slumped back onto the bed, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at him, the unease that followed him everywhere now. Delta 7 was still out there, waiting for him, and the thought of facing THR Nox, a death world where every step could be his last, filled him with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. For better or worse, Danny was about to take the biggest risk of his life. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Danny barely slept, his mind consumed with the enormity of the decision he'd made. THR Nox was a world of violent ecosystems, deadly predators, and hostile terrain. No one had ever returned from an expedition there without scars, and most didn't return at all. And yet here he was, preparing to step onto that very world with nothing but his bond with Delta 7 as his anchor. The Academy had pulled out all the stops to prepare him for the mission. His quarters had been equipped with supplies for survival on a hostile world, and the medics ensured he had everything needed to handle his injuries during the journey. He'd been given a sleek, lightweight armor that would provide some protection against the harsh conditions. But the truth was that no armor would protect him from everything, not on THR Nox. In the final hours before departure, Delta 7 remained by his side. The creature's presence was a constant, and Danny found himself both comforted and unsettled by it. Delta 7 had always been there, even when Danny had doubted himself. But this was different. The stakes were higher now, and the creature's instincts were unpredictable. What if it couldn't keep its primal urges at bay in an environment like THR Nox? As Danny stood in the Academy's landing bay, the shuttle gleaming in front of him, he felt a wave of unease wash over him. This was real. This wasn't a simulation or a training exercise. He was about to enter the unknown with a creature who could tear him apart in seconds if it decided to. Yar approached him, flanked by a small group of medics and security personnel. His eyes, as always, were steady, calculating. "Cadet Danny, the shuttle is prepped and ready. Are you sure you want to go through with this? You can still back out. We can send another team." "No," Danny interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm ready." He didn't want to admit it, but he was terrified. There was no turning back now, and deep down, he knew that the Academy had made him the face of this experiment. If he failed, they would see it as a failure of humanity's adaptability. He couldn't let that happen. Yar studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, but know this, Cadet. This is no longer just about you. It's about what you represent, the potential for humanity to understand and live alongside the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. That's what the Council expects from this mission." The weight of those words hit Danny like a hammer. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was representing every human who had ever been underestimated, every human who had ever been thought of as incapable of coexisting with the galaxy's most lethal species. If he succeeded, he'd change everything. But if he failed, humanity would be seen as just another species too weak to survive in the brutal galaxy. Danny pushed the thought aside. He didn't have the luxury of fear, not anymore. The shuttle's engines hummed to life, and the large doors of the landing bay began to close, sealing them off from the rest of the Academy. Danny felt the sudden weight of isolation as the shuttle lifted off, moving toward the edge of the Academy's orbit. Delta 7 was with him, of course, lying in the cargo bay just beyond the door. It had been sedated for the journey, though Danny could tell it wasn't fully unconscious. Its glowing eyes were only half closed, and every now and then he could hear a low rumble emanating from the creature, like it was restless even in its sleep. As the shuttle's engines pushed them further into space, Danny stared out the window. The stars stretched out before him, infinite and cold. Somewhere down there, THR Nox awaited, a world that had crushed every expedition sent to its surface. The thought of the planet made his stomach tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, that the bond he shared with Delta 7, as unnatural as it was, might be the only thing standing between him and an early grave. The journey took hours, and during that time, Danny couldn't help but run over every possible scenario in his mind. The Academy had briefed him on the dangers of the planet, but it all seemed abstract in the sterile comfort of the shuttle. Nox was alive, an angry, violent world where even the smallest mistake could lead to death. "We're approaching Nox," the voice of the pilot broke through his thoughts, calm and mechanical. "Prepare for descent. I repeat, prepare for descent." Danny took a deep breath. The time for preparation was over. His heart raced, but he forced himself to breathe slowly to steady his hands as he reached for his gear. He could hear Delta 7 growling softly beyond the door, its massive form stirring with anticipation. The shuttle began its descent, and Danny's stomach lurched as they broke through the atmosphere. He could feel the ship shaking slightly as they entered the planet's turbulent airspace. As the shuttle finally broke through the clouds, the view of Nox stretched out before him. It was a vast, jagged landscape, endless mountain ranges, deep valleys filled with mist and dense, almost suffocating forests. The ground was rocky, cracked, and scorched in some places. Danny could see smoke rising from several areas on the surface, signs of the planet's constant geological activity. The shuttle touched down with a gentle thud, the landing gear sinking into the rocky soil of Nox. Danny stood, his legs shaky from the long journey. He grabbed his pack, adjusting it on his shoulders before taking one final glance at Delta 7. The creature's eyes locked onto his, its gaze unwavering. "Stay close," Danny murmured as he made his way to the shuttle's exit, stepping onto the alien planet for the first time. The air was thick and heavy, the scent of sulfur and burnt wood hanging in the atmosphere. He could feel the planet's hostility seeping into his skin, the oppressive weight of its dangers pressing down on him. As he stepped into the clearing just outside the shuttle, a low growl echoed from behind him. Danny turned to see Delta 7 emerging from the cargo hold, its massive frame filling the entrance. It walked toward him, its steps slow but purposeful. The creature's presence was almost overwhelming, a protective shield that Danny couldn't quite explain. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He wasn't sure if he and Delta 7 could survive this planet. But they were in this together, for better or worse. "We're not alone here," Danny whispered to himself, his eyes scanning the surrounding wilderness. The first test of their bond had begun. And as the wind howled through the jagged peaks, Danny realized that every step they took from here on out would either solidify their bond or break it completely. And whatever happened, the planet had a way of testing the strongest of beings. They would have to prove themselves or they wouldn't survive the night. The wind howled across the rocky plains of Nox, a constant biting force that stung Danny's face as he stood at the threshold of the shuttle. Delta 7 stood beside him, its massive frame blocking some of the wind, but Danny still felt the chill seep into his bones. The planet was alive in ways he hadn't expected. It was hostile, raw, and unforgiving. The landscape stretched before him like a battlefield, jagged peaks rising in the distance, mist swirling around them like ghosts. The air smelled of sulfur, damp earth, and something else, something primal ancient. This was a world that fought to survive, and it didn't care who or what stood in its way. Danny adjusted the strap of his pack, glancing back at the shuttle. The pilot was already preparing to take off again, the shuttle's engines roaring to life as it ascended into the atmosphere. He was alone now. The only company he had was Delta 7, a creature that could kill him in seconds if it chose to. It hadn't done so yet, but Danny knew it was still a possibility. He didn't know why it hadn't attacked, but he had a feeling it had something to do with the bond they shared. Still, he wasn't naive enough to believe that everything was safe. "We're in this together, right?" Danny muttered to himself, more to reassure himself than anything else. He turned to look at Delta 7, who was standing just behind him, its massive head swiveling from side to side as it scanned the environment. Its glowing eyes were focused, calculating, as if assessing every possible threat. Delta 7's gaze shifted back to Danny, and the creature let out a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't entirely friendly either. It was protective. Danny couldn't help but feel a strange comfort in its presence. It wasn't just an apex predator anymore. It had become something more, something that, for reasons Danny still couldn't fully understand, had decided that it needed to protect him. He swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. The mission had only just begun, and already the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. They had to survive the first night and then every subsequent day on THR. The dangers here weren't just physical, they were psychological. The bond with Delta-7 was still new, and he wasn't sure what it meant for either of them. "All right," Danny said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Let's do this." They began their trek across the rocky terrain, Danny moving as carefully as he could with his injuries, though his pace was slower than he would have liked. The air was thick and heavy, and each step felt like a challenge. Every part of him screamed to take it slow, to rest, to wait for the pain to subside. But he couldn't afford to, not on THR. As they moved further into the wilderness, Danny could feel the planet's oppressive presence closing in around him. The ground was uneven, filled with rocks and jagged edges, and the vegetation, sparse but dangerous-looking, seemed to move in the wind like living things. Suddenly, Delta-7 stopped, its body rigid as it lowered its head, nostrils flaring. The creature's claws scraped the ground as it carefully shifted its position, its eyes scanning the surrounding area with increasing intensity. Danny's heart raced. He had been so focused on the landscape that he hadn't noticed the change in Delta-7's behavior. The creature was on high alert. "What is it?" Danny whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure whether he was asking Delta-7 or himself. The wind shifted, carrying with it a new scent, the faint, musky odor of something dangerous. Something large. Danny's pulse quickened as he instinctively reached for the blaster strapped to his waist, though he knew it would do little against the kind of creature that roamed these lands. Delta-7's growl deepened, vibrating through the air as it crouched lower to the ground. The massive creature's body seemed to expand, its muscles rippling as it prepared for something. Danny's instincts kicked in, something coming. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the environment. The rocks, the shifting shadows, the faint crackling noise in the distance. Then he saw it. A massive form emerged from the foggy shadows, moving silently through the dense mist. It was unlike anything Danny had ever seen before, a creature covered in thick, spiked armor, with long, curved horns and glowing red eyes. It was tall, towering over them, its claws digging into the ground as it moved forward with a terrifying purpose. Delta-7 reacted instantly. With a deafening roar, it charged at the creature, its body surging forward with frightening speed. Danny barely had time to react before Delta-7, and the strange creature collided in a massive explosion of force. The ground shook beneath Danny's feet as the two monsters grappled, their massive bodies crashing into the rocks. Danny's heart raced as he fumbled for his blaster. He wasn't sure what to do. The two creatures were locked in a brutal fight, each one displaying an incredible amount of strength and fury. Delta-7's growls and roars echoed through the air as it bared its fangs, swiping at the other creature with its massive claws. For a moment, Danny hesitated. Should he intervene? Should he try to stop the fight or just let it play out? The decision was taken from him in an instant. The strange creature swung its claw at Delta-7's side, scoring a deep gash along the creature's armored body. Delta-7 let out an agonized roar as it staggered back, its massive form momentarily faltering. The creature advanced, ready to finish the fight. That's when Danny realized what had to be done. He lunged forward, grabbing a sharp rock from the ground and hurling it at the creature's head. The stone hit with a sickening crack, causing the creature to pause and turn toward Danny. It growled low, its glowing eyes narrowing. But before it could charge, Delta-7 was upon it again, slamming its body into the creature's side with a bone-shaking impact. Danny watched in awe as the battle raged on, Delta-7's protective instincts fully on display. The creature fought with every ounce of its strength, but it was no match for Delta-7. With a final, devastating swipe of its claws, Delta-7 brought the creature to the ground, pinning it under its weight. The silence that followed was deafening. Danny stood frozen, heart still racing as he watched Delta-7 stand over the fallen creature. The massive Vorkos growled once, just to assert its dominance before it stepped back, leaving the creature on the ground. It was over. Danny exhaled slowly, the tension in his body unwinding. He knew they had survived their first true test on THR, but he also knew that this wasn't the end. There would be more dangers ahead, more challenges. And through it all, Delta-7 would be by his side, guiding him, protecting him. Their bond had just been solidified in a way neither of them could ever undo. As Danny stood there, the weight of the moment settling over him, he realized that no matter what happened next, his survival, and perhaps the survival of humanity, depended on the unpredictable, terrifying creature now at his side. The real journey had just begun.